What if the person you trusted the most was built on a lie? A woman runs from a ruined past in New York, carrying nothing but a secret and a stolen identity. A hardened cowboy waits for a bride he has never met, only to find a stranger standing in her place. But instead of anger, he chooses something unexpected. Out here, in the ruthless lands of Wyoming, survival isn't about truth or lies. It's about who you become when the world turns against you. And tonight, a storm is coming, one that will test love, trust, and the very meaning of strength. Stay with me, because this story is not what you think.
The shrieking of the Union Pacific's iron brakes sounded like a dying beast, echoing across the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Wyoming Territory. I stepped down onto the wooden platform of the Cheyenne station, and the wind immediately stole the breath from my lungs. It was late autumn in 1886, but the air already carried the bitter, biting promise of ice. I pulled my thin wool shawl tighter around my shoulders, shivering in my navy dress. It was a garment that had once been the height of New York fashion, now hopelessly threadbare at the cuffs and stained with 3,000 miles of coal dust and desperation. The platform was a chaotic blur of motion, cattlemen shouting, conductors blowing whistles, and families reuniting. I stood frozen in the center of it all, a solitary ghost gripping a battered carpet bag until my knuckles turned white. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "He isn't going to come," a small, terrified voice whispered in my mind. "And if he does, he'll send you right back." I couldn't go back. There was nothing left for me in New York but the ashes of my reputation. The wolves of Wall Street, wearing my own uncle's face, had made sure of that, framing me for a financial ruin I hadn't caused. I had traded the gilded cages of high society for the raw, brutal frontier, answering an advertisement from a Wyoming rancher in a final, desperate gamble for survival. But my survival was built on a lie. Hidden in the inner pocket of my coat was a duplicate of the photograph I had mailed to Elias Thorne. It wasn't me. In a moment of paralyzing insecurity and fear, I had sent him a portrait of my cousin, Evelyn. Evelyn with her perfect porcelain skin, her soft blonde curls, and her innocent, helpless smile. I was not Evelyn. My hair was a stubborn dark auburn, currently plastered to my soot-smudged forehead. My features were too sharp, my eyes too calculating, and my hands, though still uncalloused, were trembling with a fierce, cornered energy. I was a fugitive masquerading as a mail-order bride. Gradually, the crowd thinned. The locomotive hissed its final cloud of steam and chugged away, leaving a hollow silence in its wake. The wind howled through the empty platform, kicking up a small cyclone of dust at my feet. Then a shadow separated itself from the corner of the station house. He didn't walk so much as he advanced. Every step of his heavy leather boots against the wooden planks sounded like the steady ticking of a clock counting down to my ruin. He was taller than I had imagined from his brief, pragmatic letters. Broad-shouldered and lean, he moved with the predatory grace of a man entirely in his element. A worn Stetson was pulled low over his forehead, casting his eyes in shadow, but I could feel the weight of his gaze pinning me in place. He wore a heavy canvas coat lined with sheepskin, and the leather holster strapped to his thigh looked less like an accessory and more like a natural extension of his body. This was Elias Thorne. I stopped breathing. The instinct to turn and run seized my muscles, but I had only $3.40 to my name. There was nowhere left to run. He stopped 3 feet in front of me. Up close, his face was a landscape of harsh angles and weathered skin, testament to years spent fighting the sun, the wind, and the earth. There was a faint, jagged scar cutting through the stubble along his jawline. He was intimidating. He was real. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat. My stomach plummeted to the floorboards. Slowly, Elias pulled out a small tintype photograph. Evelyn's photograph. He looked at the picture. Then he looked up at me. The silence stretched, agonizing and heavy. I braced myself for the anger. I waited for the cold dismissal, for him to call me a liar, a fraud, a cheat. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, preparing to pick up my heavy bag and face the freezing Wyoming night alone. I can explain, I stammered, the sophisticated vocabulary I prided myself on, abandoning me completely. My voice was a pathetic, reedy scrape against the wind. Mr. Thorne, He didn't yell. His jaw ticked once. Then he deliberately slipped the photograph back into his coat pocket, as if dismissing it from existence. He closed the distance between us in a single fluid stride. Before I could flinch, his large, leather-gloved hand reached out, not to strike me, but to take the heavy, fraying handle of my carpet bag from my aching grip. The sheer strength in his hand was startling, yet his touch was remarkably careful. He leaned down, the scent of pine, leather, and horse masking the coal smoke of the station. His eyes, a startling, piercing shade of blue beneath the brim of his hat, locked onto mine. There was no pity in them. There was no disappointment. There was only a profound, grounded certainty that made my breath catch in my throat. "You're far more beautiful than your picture," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate straight through my bones. The words stopped my heart. The air rushed out of me in a sudden, shaky exhale, as the first warm tear carved a clean path down my soot-stained cheek. Elias Thorne didn't ask for an explanation. He just turned, my heavy bag looking weightless in his grip, and nodded toward the dusty street. "Come on, Clara," he said quietly. "Let's get you home." The wagon ride out of Cheyenne was a silent descent into an alien world. If New York was a suffocating cage of brick, glass, and constant noise, the Wyoming Territory was an ocean of terrifying emptiness. The sky here did not just sit above the earth, it dominated it, a vast bruised canvas of slate-gray clouds that seemed to press down on my shoulders. I sat stiffly on the wooden bench of the buckboard wagon, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my fingers ached. Beside me, Elias Thorne handled the reins of the two massive draft horses with an effortless, quiet authority. He hadn't spoken since he helped me onto the seat. He didn't demand explanations. He didn't ask about Evelyn's photograph. He merely offered me a heavy wool blanket, smelling of cedar and wood smoke, which I accepted with a silent nod, wrapping it tightly around my shivering frame. For hours, the only sounds were the rhythmic thud of hooves, the creak of the wagon's suspension, and the relentless howling wind that whipped through the sagebrush. I stole covert glances at him from the corner of my eye. His profile was carved from the same hard granite as the distant mountains. He was a man composed of sharp edges and profound silences. I wondered, with a fresh wave of panic, what he expected of me. What did a man like this do with a disgraced city girl who couldn't even bake a proper loaf of bread? By mid-afternoon, the gray sky surrendered to a bitter, biting drizzle. We pulled into a small, desolate settlement, a mere cluster of weathered buildings huddled together as if seeking warmth. Elias drew the horses to a halt in front of a sprawling, unpainted structure bearing a faded sign, "Miller's Mercantile and Freight." "Need to pick up winter supplies," Elias said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the wind. "Stay in the wagon if you'd like. It's warm enough under the wool." "I'll come," I said quickly. The thought of sitting alone in the freezing drizzle was unbearable, but more than that, I desperately needed to feel solid ground beneath my boots. Inside, the Mercantile smelled of raw tobacco, oiled leather, and stale coffee. Dust motes danced in the dim light, filtering through the grime-caked windows. Behind a long, scarred oak counter stood a man with a receding hairline and a smile that didn't reach his shrewd, watery eyes. "Elias," the man boomed, wiping his hands on a filthy apron. "Wasn't expecting you down from Mustang Creek for another week. And who is this lovely, if somewhat dampened creature?" His eyes crawled over my wet hair and travel-stained dress, with a mix of curiosity and patronizing amusement. "My wife, Clara," Elias said. The word wife hung in the air, heavy and unfamiliar. It sent a strange jolt straight to my toes. "We need the winter order, Miller. 14 sacks of winter wheat seed, 6 barrels of your best flour, 3 pounds of coffee beans, and 2 kegs of roofing nails. Miller's smile widened, revealing yellowed teeth. Certainly, certainly. Getting ready to bunker down before the snows, eh? I'll have my boy load the wagon. Swain? While Miller shouted orders to the back room, Elias moved to inspect a display of leather harnesses. I stood near the counter, wrapping my arms around myself to stop my shivering. From the far corner of the store, a sound broke through the general clatter. Click-clack. Tappity-tap-click. I froze. It was a telegraph machine. The rhythmic metallic pulse was the heartbeat of Wall Street, the sound of fortunes being made and destroyed in a matter of seconds. It was the sound of my uncle's opulent office, where I had spent hours poring over ledgers, identifying market trends that he later claimed as his own before framing me for his missing funds. The sound made my stomach clench with a visceral, sickening nostalgia. "All right, Elias," Miller said, pulling a stubby pencil from behind his ear and licking the lead. He scribbled on a piece of brown butcher paper. "Let's see here. With the freight costs going up and the scarcity of good wheat, that'll come to a total of $62.40. Elias reached into his heavy coat, his face impassive, pulling out a worn leather purse. He didn't argue. He was a man of the land, accustomed to the physical weight of things, not the invisible trickery of numbers on a page. I looked at the butcher paper. The numbers were scrawled messily, but to my eyes they glowed as clearly as a lighthouse beacon. 14 sacks of seed at a posted price of $1.85. 6 barrels of flour at $2.15. 3 pounds of coffee at 45 cents. 2 kegs of nails at $3.60. My mind snapped into absolute crystalline focus. The panic of the journey, the cold, the fear of Elias. It all vanished. This was my domain. "Excuse me," I said. My voice wasn't the reedy whisper from the train station. It was sharp, clear, and carried the undeniable authority of a New York boardroom. Both men turned to look at me. Elias paused, his hand hovering over his purse. I stepped up to the counter, ignoring Miller's condescending smirk. I tapped my index finger against the oak surface, a sharp thwack that echoed the telegraph's rhythm. "Mr. Miller," I said, meeting his watery eyes with a stare of pure ice. 14 sacks at $1.85 is $25.90. 6 barrels of flour at $2.15 is $12.90. The coffee is $1.35. The nails are $7.20. I didn't break eye contact. $25.90 plus $12.90 plus $1.35 plus $7.20. The total is $47.35, unless you are charging us a $15.05 freight fee for items that are already sitting in your back room. I suggest you recalculate." The silence in the mercantile was absolute. Even the telegraph machine seemed to pause. Miller's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He looked at the paper, then at me, then at Elias, opening and closing his mouth like a landed trout. I must have... The one carried over wrong," he stammered, frantically scratching out the total. I turned my head slightly to look at Elias. His hand had dropped away from his purse. He was staring at me. The shadows beneath the brim of his Stetson couldn't hide the sudden sharp gleam of surprise in his blue eyes. It wasn't just surprise. It was a profound, quiet respect. He didn't look at me like a frail woman who needed protecting. In that moment, he looked at me like an equal. 47. 35 it is, Elias said softly, pulling the exact amount from his purse and dropping the coins onto the counter with a heavy, satisfying clink. "Thank you, Miller. My wife is very particular about mathematics." As we walked back out into the freezing drizzle, Elias didn't say a word. He helped me up onto the wagon seat, his hands lingering on my waist a fraction of a second longer than necessary. As he took the reins and clicked his tongue to the horses, I heard him let out a low, breathy sound. It took me a moment to realize it was a chuckle. We arrived at Mustang Creek Ranch just as the sun bled out over the horizon, painting the jagged peaks of the Wind River Range in violent shades of violet and crimson. The ranch was not a grand estate. It was a collection of sturdy, unpainted log buildings crouched in a valley, built to withstand nature rather than conquer it. There was a large barn, a series of corrals holding heavily muscled horses, and a main cabin with smoke curling welcomingly from its stone chimney. As the wagon rolled into the yard, a man stepped out of the barn. He looked as though he had been carved from the very same petrified wood as the fence posts. He was older, with a face deeply lined by sun and sorrow, a thick gray mustache and a left hand missing its ring and pinky fingers. He spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the dirt as we approached. "'Bout time," the old man grunted, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto me. "See you brought the catalog bride." Elias set the brake. "Clara, this is Huckabee. Everyone calls him Huck. He runs this place when I'm too stubborn to." Elias jumped down and offered me his hand. "Huck, this is Clara. She's going to be my wife." Huck didn't offer a greeting. He looked at my pale, unblemished hands, my ruined silk dress, and my shivering shoulders. His expression was a mixture of deep skepticism and outright pity. "Winter's coming, Elias," Huck said, his voice gravelly and devoid of warmth. "Hope she don't shatter when the frost hits." I stood tall despite the exhaustion threatening to pull me to the mud. I looked the old cowboy dead in the eye. "I survived a 2,000-mile train ride, Mr. Huckabee. I assure you I am not made of glass." Huck grunted again, though his eyes flashed with a microscopic hint of amusement. "We'll see, New York, we'll see." I looked at the rough-hewn cabin that was to be my new home. The wind howled through the valley, a lonely, terrifying sound. But as I touched the cold wood of the porch railing, I made a silent vow. I would not break. I had outsmarted the wolves of Wall Street. I would learn to survive the wolves of Wyoming. A month in the Wyoming Territory was not measured in days, but in blisters. If anyone had told Clara Montgomery of New York that she would find a sense of profound satisfaction in the smell of lye soap and boiling linens, she would have assumed they were mad. Yet here I was. My hands, once my greatest vanity, were ruined. The smooth, manicured skin was gone, replaced by raw, red knuckles, angry burns from the cast-iron stove, and calluses that thickened with every bucket of water I hauled from the frozen creek. My expensive dresses were packed away in the bottom of my trunk, replaced by practical, heavy cotton skirts, and one of Elias's old flannel shirts that swallowed my frame, but kept the biting drafts at bay. The transition was brutal. The first week, I had wept out of sheer physical agony. Every muscle in my back screamed in protest as I learned to chop kindling, scrub the rough plank floors, and prepare meals that didn't consist entirely of burnt ash. But I never cried where Elias or Huck could see me. I wept into my thin pillow at night, and by dawn I was up, lighting the fire before the men had even stirred. Huck's skepticism didn't vanish, but it morphed into a gruff, silent observation. He stopped complaining about my cooking after I learned to make biscuits that didn't double as hunting ammunition. Last week, when I managed to wrestle a heavy saddle onto a fence rail without asking for help, he had merely tipped his hat and muttered, "About time you found your center of gravity." It was the highest praise I could have hoped for. Elias, however, remained an enigma. We were married by a circuit preacher who passed through the valley during my second week. It was a brief, pragmatic affair in the main room of the cabin, devoid of flowers or music. Elias had promised to provide for me, and I had promised to stand by him. But our marriage existed only in the daylight. When the sun set, Elias took a lantern and a wool blanket, excusing himself to the small insulated tack room in the barn. He never pushed. He never demanded the rights of a husband. He treated me with a careful, almost agonizing reverence, keeping a physical distance that both relieved and completely maddened me. We were partners in the survival of the ranch, moving in a synchronized dance of chores and responsibilities. But a wall of unspoken truths stood firmly between us. The heaviest stone in that wall was my lie. Every time Elias looked at me, I felt the phantom weight of Evelyn's photograph burning in his coat pocket. It was late November. The first heavy snow had yet to fall, but the earth was frozen solid, crunching like shattered glass beneath my boots. It was a night dominated by a massive silver full moon that bathed the Wind River Valley in an ethereal, ghostly light. I couldn't sleep. The silence of the cabin was oppressive. I threw Elias's heavy wool blanket over my nightgown, slipped on my boots, and stepped out onto the porch. Elias was there. He was sitting on a wooden crate, the silver moonlight catching the sharp planes of his face. Across his lap lay his Winchester rifle, a rag, and a tin of oil resting beside him. He wasn't cleaning it, he was just staring out at the dark silhouette of the mountains, lost in a memory I couldn't reach. I stood in the doorway, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I couldn't carry the lie anymore. I couldn't build a life with this man, a man who worked himself to the bone to ensure I had food and shelter, while hiding the very core of who I was. I stepped onto the creaking floorboards. He didn't flinch, but his eyes shifted to me, reflecting the moonlight. "Too cold for you to be out here, Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble that instantly warmed the freezing air. "I couldn't sleep," I murmured, pulling the blanket tighter around my throat. I moved to the wooden railing, standing a few feet away from him. The air was so crisp it hurt to breathe. "Coyotes keeping you awake?" he asked, returning his gaze to the horizon. No. I closed my eyes, summoning every ounce of courage I had used to face down Miller at the Mercantile, to face down my uncle in New York. "My conscience is—" The rag in his hand went still. He didn't speak, waiting. "Elias," I started, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "When I answered your advertisement, when I sent you that letter, I didn't send you my picture." The words hung in the freezing air, sharp and jagged. "The photograph you carry in your pocket," I continued, forcing the words out before I lost my nerve. "That is my cousin, Evelyn. She is everything society demands a woman to be. Beautiful, docile, soft. I sent her face because I knew my own would not be enough. I knew my features were too sharp, my demeanor too intense. I was terrified that if you saw the real me, you would never buy my train ticket." He slowly set the Winchester down, resting it against the log wall of the cabin. He turned to face me fully, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "I'm not a destitute orphan who simply fell on hard times, Elias," I confessed, the dam finally breaking. "I am a fugitive. My uncle runs one of the largest investment firms in New York. I had a mind for numbers. I found a massive deficit in his ledgers, embezzlement. Before I could go to the authorities, he framed me. He forged my signature on the transfer documents. I was facing prison, ruin, a total destruction of my name. I ran because I had no choice. I lied to you to save my own life." I stopped, gasping for air as if I had been running. I stared down at the frost-covered floorboards, waiting for the explosion. I waited for him to stand up, to tell me to pack my bags, to call me a criminal and a liar. I heard the rustle of heavy canvas. Elias reached into his coat pocket. He stood up, towering over me. In his large, calloused hand, he held the small tin-type photograph. The moonlight illuminated Evelyn's perfect, empty smile. Elias looked at the picture for a long moment. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed the tintype off the porch. It landed face down in the frozen mud. My head snapped up. I stared at him, bewildered. What are you doing?" "I knew," Elias said softly. The earth seemed to tilt on its axis. You knew? At the station?" He took a step closer. The heat radiating from his large frame was a sudden comfort against the freezing night. "When I stood at that station in Cheyenne, I had that picture in my hand. I was looking for a delicate blonde girl in a silk dress. And then I saw you." He reached out. I flinched, expecting anger, but his gloved hand gently touched the edge of my blanket, pulling it snug against my neck. "You were shivering," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "You were covered in soot, your dress was ruined, and you looked like you were about to collapse. But Clara, He tilted his head, his blue eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. Your eyes! You were looking at that crowd like a cornered wolf, like a woman who had the whole world against her and was ready to fight it with her bare hands. He stepped closer, the distance between us evaporating. I had to tilt my head back to hold his gaze. I didn't want the girl in the picture, Elias said, the raw honesty in his voice vibrating in my chest. The frontier eats girls like that alive. Wyoming doesn't care about pretty faces. When the blizzards hit, when the cattle die, when the world freezes over, a pretty face won't keep the fire burning. He raised his hand, his thumb brushing lightly against my cheekbone. It was the most intimate contact we had shared since he helped me off the train. My skin burned beneath his touch. I saw a survivor standing on that platform, he whispered. I saw a woman with a mind sharp enough to cut glass, and a spirit that refused to break. I saw my equal. That's why I took your bag. That's why I married you. Tears, hot and fast, blurred my vision. The crushing weight of the guilt I had carried for a month dissolved, replaced by a soaring, terrifying lightness. He didn't care about the scandal. He didn't care about the lie. He saw the real me, the calculating, desperate, fierce woman underneath, and he wanted her. You aren't angry? I managed to choke out. I'm angry that some bastard in New York made you feel like you had to hide, Elias said, his jaw tightening briefly before his expression softened again. But I'm not angry that you're here. You outsmarted a thief, and you put Miller in his place in 3 seconds flat. I reckon having a fugitive with a head for numbers is exactly what this ranch needs. A watery, broken laugh escaped my lips. I couldn't help it. The absurdity of it all, the profound relief, washed over me. Elias smiled. It was a rare, beautiful thing that completely transformed his rugged face, making him look years younger. Without thinking, I reached out. My raw, blistered hands grasped the lapels of his heavy coat. I didn't pull him down, but I held onto him, anchoring myself to the only solid thing in this terrifying, beautiful wilderness. Elias didn't move away. He covered my hands with his own, his thumbs gently tracing the calluses I had earned on his land. He didn't kiss me. He didn't push. But as we stood there on the porch, bathed in the silver light of the Wyoming moon, the wall between us finally shattered into a million pieces. We were no longer strangers bound by a desperate contract. We were two scarred people, standing shoulder to shoulder against the coming winter. The days following my confession on the porch felt as though a great suffocating iron band had been struck from my chest. I no longer walked the floorboards of the cabin like an intruder. When I washed Elias's heavy work shirts, or when I sat across from him at the scarred wooden table sharing a meal of venison stew, I met his eyes freely. The ghost of Evelyn no longer sat between us. In the wake of that truth, another, quieter shift occurred. I began to take over the ledger. It started innocently enough. I had noticed Elias struggling by the light of a kerosene lamp, rubbing his tired eyes as he tried to tally the season's expenses and project the winter feed costs. His handwriting was a bold, aggressive scrawl, but the columns of numbers were disorganized, chaotic. Without asking, I had pulled the heavy leather-bound book toward me, picked up the pen, and smoothed out the chaos. I created neat, disciplined ledgers, categorizing expenses, calculating depreciation on the equipment, and projecting our financial runway through the spring thaw. When Elias saw what I had done, he hadn't spoken for a full minute. He had simply run his calloused finger down the perfectly aligned columns, a look of profound respect settling over his features. From that day on, the financial survival of Mustang Creek Ranch became my undisputed territory. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early December, when the true reality of the Wyoming territory arrived at our doorstep. I was at the table, ink stains on my fingertips, cross-referencing the cost of grain against the expected yield of the spring foals, when the sudden, sharp barking of our ranch dogs shattered the quiet. A moment later, the low, collective rumble of approaching horses vibrated through the floorboards. Not one or two horses. A dozen. I set my pen down. A cold prickle of unease washed over the back of my neck. I stood and moved to the window, pulling back the gingham curtain. A procession of riders was entering the yard. At the front rode a man who looked like he belonged in a velvet-lined carriage in Manhattan, not on the dusty plains of the frontier. He was mounted on a magnificent purebred black stallion that dwarfed Elias's working quarter horses. The man wore a finely tailored broadcloth suit beneath an immaculate fur-collared overcoat. Even from a distance, the glint of silver on his spurs and the polished ivory handle of the revolver at his hip spoke of obscene, unearned wealth. Behind him rode a half-dozen hard-eyed men. They didn't look like ranch hands. They looked like mercenaries. They carried Winchester rifles across their saddles with a casual, terrifying familiarity. I saw Elias step out of the barn, a pitchfork still in his hand. He didn't run, but his posture instantly changed. His shoulders squared, his stance widening. The relaxed, quiet cowboy I had come to know vanished, replaced by a man bracing for a physical blow. Huck emerged from the corral a moment later, a heavy shotgun suddenly resting in the crook of his arm. I didn't wait. I wiped my inky hands on my apron, pulled my shawl tight, and walked out the front door, stepping onto the porch just as the man on the black stallion brought his horse to a halt a few yards from Elias. "Afternoon, Elias," the man said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and dripped with a condescension that made my stomach turn. It was the exact tone my uncle used right before he bankrupted a competitor. "Silas," Elias replied, his voice a flat, dead calm. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't invite the man to dismount. "You're a long way from your own fence line." Silas Vance smiled, a perfectly practiced expression that reached nowhere near his pale, predatory eyes. "A man likes to survey the valley, check on his neighbors before the hard winter sets in. I hear the almanac is predicting a brutal one." "We're prepared," Elias said. The knuckles on the hand gripping the pitchfork were stark white. "Are you?" Silas let his gaze drift lazily around the yard, taking in the unpainted barn, the modest corrals, and the small cabin. "It takes a lot of capital to survive a true Wyoming freeze, Elias. I've seen proud men freeze to death out here because they were too stubborn to accept a fair price for struggling land." "Mustang Creek isn't struggling," Elias said softly. "And it isn't for sale." "Everything is for sale, Elias. It's simply a matter of finding the right number." Silas Vance leaned forward in his custom-tooled saddle. "The water rights to the upper creek, for instance. I'm expanding my herds. My cattle need that water. It seems a shame for it to be wasted on a handful of Mustangs when it could be fueling an empire. The water flows on my land. My father filed the deed, and I hold it. It's not going anywhere." Silas sighed, a theatrical display of disappointment. "I worry about you, Elias. Really, I do. Accidents happen so frequently out here in the wilds. Fences get cut, herds get scattered, sometimes sparks catch in dry haylofts. It would be a tragedy if you were to suffer such misfortunes." It was a threat, naked and ugly, wrapped in the thin veneer of a neighborly chat. My blood ran cold, but beneath the ice, a familiar blinding anger began to burn. I recognized this man. I had sat at dinner tables with men just like him in New York. They believed the world existed solely for their consumption, and that anyone in their way was merely an obstacle to be bought or crushed. Before Elias could respond, Silas's pale eyes shifted past the cowboy and landed on me. His gaze moved over my plain dress, my messy hair, and stopped on my face. The cold calculation in his eyes shifted into something slick and appraising. It made my skin crawl. "Well, well," Silas murmured, his horse shifting restlessly beneath him. "I heard a rumor you had ordered yourself a bride from the civilized world, Elias. I assumed it was a joke. What a fragile, pretty little bird you've dragged out into the dirt." Silas touched the brim of his pristine hat. "Silas Vance, my dear. I must say you look entirely out of place among this squalor. If you ever find yourself tiring of the peasant life, my estate is just 10 miles north. We have actual crystal and imported tea." Elias took a step forward, the pitchfork lowering, his body coiled like a steel spring. "Don't speak to my wife." The words were low, vibrating with a lethal, barely contained violence. "It's all right, Elias," I said. My voice cut through the heavy, tense air. I stepped off the porch, the mud squelching beneath my boots. I didn't hide behind Elias. I walked up to stand right beside him, crossing my arms over my chest, tilting my chin up to look Silas Vance directly in his pale eyes. "Mr. Vance," I said, projecting my voice with the crisp, icy enunciation of a Manhattan heiress shutting down a sleazy suitor. "I am entirely familiar with crystal and imported tea. I am also familiar with men who use wealth to mask their utter lack of character. I find the dirt here far cleaner than the company you offer." The mercenary riders behind Silas shifted uncomfortably, murmuring among themselves. Huck let out a sudden barking cough that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. Silas's smile vanished. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped, revealing the sheer, ugly malice underneath. His eyes narrowed to slits. "You have a sharp tongue, Mrs. Thorne," Silas said, his voice dropping its cultured warmth, turning hard and flat. "You should learn to bite it. Out here, words have consequences, and the wind doesn't care how clever you think you are when it freezes you solid." "We'll manage the wind," I replied evenly, "and our land." Silas stared at me for a long moment, calculating, assessing a variable he hadn't anticipated. Then he looked back down at Elias. "Think about my offer, Elias," Silas said, pulling his horse's head around, "before the winter makes the decision for you." He spurred his black stallion and rode out of the yard, his mercenaries trailing behind him like a pack of loyal, dangerous dogs. We stood in silence until the dust of their departure settled. I felt my knees begin to tremble. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, stark reality. Elias threw the pitchfork. It sailed across the yard and buried its prongs deep into the heavy timber of the corral fence with a violent thwack. He stood breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his hands balled into fists. I stepped toward him, reaching out to touch his arm. "Elias!" He flinched, pulling away, not in anger at me, but as if he couldn't bear to be touched while the rage was still boiling under his skin. He scrubbed a hand over his face. "You shouldn't have done that, Clara," he said, his voice rough. "You shouldn't have drawn his attention. He was threatening you. He was threatening our home. He is the law." Elias spun to face me, his eyes blazing with a helpless, desperate fury. "You think this is New York? You think there are police to call? Silas Vance owns the sheriff. He owns the judges. He has 30 men on his payroll who would slit a throat for a bottle of whiskey. If he decides he wants Mustang Creek, he won't just buy it. He'll take it over our dead bodies." The truth of his words hit me like a physical blow. In New York, the violence of men like my uncle was financial. It destroyed reputations and bank accounts. Here, the violence was literal. It destroyed lives. "Then we fight him," I said, my voice shaking but resolute. "We document everything. We protect the boundaries." Elias looked at me, the anger draining from his face, leaving behind a profound, terrifying weariness. He looked at the vast, open plains, then back down at me. "I won't let him hurt you," Elias whispered, more to himself than to me. "I won't let him take what is mine. Not again." The last two words hung in the air, a slip of the tongue that held a universe of unspoken pain. Not again. Before I could ask him what he meant, he turned and walked into the dark cavern of the barn, leaving me alone in the yard, the shadow of the Leviathan still chilling the afternoon air. The air changed 3 days later. It didn't happen gradually. One moment, the sky was a pale, high blue. The next, the horizon swallowed the sun, replaced by a dense, bruising wall of purple-black clouds that seemed to roll across the plains like an incoming tide of iron. The temperature plummeted with violent speed. The moisture in my breath froze the instant it left my lips, crystallizing on my eyelashes. The ranch dogs vanished under the porch, whining in terror. I was in the cabin feeding the iron stove with heavy chunks of pine when the door burst open. The wind screamed into the room, scattering ashes and papers across the floor. Elias stood in the doorway, covered in the first stinging pellets of sleet. "Huck is securing the barn!" Elias shouted over the roar of the wind, fighting to push the heavy oak door shut behind him. "The main herd is in the south pasture. They've got the tree line for cover. But the 4 late-season calves, they wandered up into the north ravine this morning. If they stay there, the drifts will bury them by nightfall." He didn't wait for a response. He moved to the corner, pulling on an extra layer of wool, his heaviest canvas duster, and a thick scarf. He grabbed a coil of rope and a kerosene lantern. "I'm coming with you," I said. Elias stopped, turning to me with a look of absolute disbelief. "No, absolutely not. You stay here. Keep the fire burning." "You can't manage 4 terrified calves in a blizzard alone, Elias. If one bolts or if you lose your footing in the ravine, you'll die out there." I was already moving, pulling my heavy boots on, wrapping a thick woolen shawl around my head and neck, and shrugging into the oversized coat he had given me. "Clara, this isn't a city snowstorm. This is a whiteout. You can't see your own hand in front of your face. It's a suicide run for someone who doesn't know the land." "Then you'd better not let go of my hand," I snapped, securing the buttons of the coat with trembling, determined fingers. I looked up at him, my heart pounding, but my resolve absolute. "I am your partner, Elias. I am your wife. I am not staying by the fire while you freeze." We stared at each other. The wind battered the log walls of the cabin, a continuous, deafening roar. Finally, his jaw tightened in a grim line, and he gave a short, sharp nod. "Tie this around your waist," he commanded, tossing me one end of the heavy rope, "and tie the other end to me. If we get separated, we're dead." We stepped out of the cabin and the world disappeared. It was as if someone had thrown a heavy, suffocating white blanket over the universe. There was no sky, no ground, no horizon. There was only a chaotic, swirling vortex of ice and snow driving sideways, hitting my exposed skin like thousands of tiny needles. The roar of the wind was absolute, drowning out all thought. Elias moved ahead, leaning his massive weight into the gale. I followed, the rope between us pulled taut. Every step was a battle. The snow was already knee-deep and rising rapidly. My lungs burned with the frigid air, and within minutes the tips of my fingers and toes began to go numb. I don't know how long we walked. It could have been 20 minutes, it could have been 2 hours. I lost all sense of time, reduced entirely to the mechanical, agonizing motion of putting one foot in front of the other, following the dark, blurred outline of Elias's back. Suddenly, Elias stopped. The rope went slack. I stumbled forward, bumping into him. He was holding the lantern high, though its light penetrated barely 3 feet into the blinding white. Through the swirling snow, I heard a sound, a pitiful, high-pitched bleating. We had reached the ravine. Huddled against the frozen rock wall, half buried in a rising snowdrift, were the 4 calves. They were shivering violently, their eyes wide with terror, already surrendering to the cold sleep. "Grab the stragglers," Elias bellowed, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Push them! We can't lead them. We have to drive them from behind." It was brutal, chaotic work. The calves were numb and uncooperative. I threw my weight against a freezing wet animal, screaming at it to move, pushing it up the incline of the ravine. My hands, encased in wet wool mittens, lost all feeling. I fell repeatedly, plunging face first into the snow, the icy powder packing down my collar. But every time I fell, a tug on the rope from Elias hauled me back to my feet. We managed to push the calves out of the ravine, but the storm had intensified. The wind was a solid wall of force. Elias stopped, turning his back to the wind, pulling me close so I could hear him. His face was covered in a mask of ice, his eyebrows and eyelashes frozen solid. "We can't make the main house," he shouted. "We're turned around. The wind shifted. If we guess wrong, we'll walk off the property and freeze." Panic, sharp and blinding, spiked in my chest. "What do we do?" "The line shack," he yelled, pointing vaguely to our left. "Old hunting shack. It's closer. Keep pushing the calves." We fought our way through the blinding white for what felt like an eternity. My legs were turning to lead. I was shivering so violently my teeth felt loose in my gums. The dangerous, seductive urge to simply lie down in the soft snow and close my eyes began to creep into my mind. Just as my knees began to buckle, a dark shape loomed out of the whiteness. The Line Shack. It was a tiny one-room structure, barely larger than a large closet, built against a thick grove of pines. Elias shoved the calves toward the meager shelter of the trees, trusting their instincts to huddle together. Then he grabbed my arm and dragged me toward the shack's heavy wooden door. It was frozen shut. Elias threw his shoulder against it. Once. Twice. With a crack of splintering ice, the door gave way. We fell inside, and Elias slammed the door shut, dropping the heavy wooden bar across it. The sudden absence of the wind was shocking. The shack was pitch black, freezing, and smelled of dust and old pine needles. But it was still. We collapsed onto the dirt floor, gasping for air, the sound of our ragged breathing filling the small space. "Clara," Elias rasped, his voice shaking. "Clara, are you awake?" "Yes," I chattered, my entire body convulsing. "We have to get the wet clothes off now, or we'll freeze from the outside in." In the pitch black, clumsy and numb, we stripped off our frozen outer layers. The heavy duster, the soaked mittens, my ruined boots, the woolen shawl thick with ice. Elias found a small cache of emergency supplies in the corner, a few dry wool blankets and a heavy, stiff wolf pelt. He dragged them to the center of the room. "Come here," he commanded in the darkness. I crawled toward the sound of his voice. He wrapped the blankets around me, pulling me against his chest, and threw the heavy wolf pelt over both of us. We huddled together on the freezing dirt floor, a tangle of shivering limbs. I was pressed flat against his chest, my face buried in the crook of his neck. His arms were wrapped around me like a vice, trapping our body heat in a tiny, desperate cocoon. For a long time, the only reality was the violent, uncontrollable shivering, and the sound of the blizzard tearing at the roof of the shack. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the shivering began to subside. The combined heat of our bodies under the heavy pelt began to push back the freezing grip of death. The numbness in my fingers and toes was replaced by a fiery, painful throbbing as the blood returned. I became hyper-aware of the man holding me, the smell of wet wool, cedar, and the clean, masculine scent of his skin, the steady, powerful thumping of his heart against my ear. His breath, warm and rhythmic, stirring my damp hair. "I thought I lost you in the ravine," Elias whispered, the darkness making his deep voice sound incredibly intimate. "When you fell, my heart stopped. You tied a rope to me," I murmured, my voice muffled against his shirt. "You didn't let go. I'll never let go." He shifted slightly. In the dark, his hands found mine beneath the blankets. My hands were freezing, rough, and aching. He didn't pull me up to kiss my lips. He didn't seek the kind of desperate, hungry comfort that men often seek in the face of death. Instead, Elias brought my hands up to his face. I felt the prickle of his stubble against my knuckles. And then he pressed his lips to my palms. He kissed the raw, blistered skin where the axe handle had worn it away. He kissed the burns from the cast iron stove. He kissed the calluses I had built fighting for his land. It was a kiss of utter reverence. It was a worship of my sacrifice, an acknowledgement of the woman I had chosen to become. It moved me more profoundly than any romantic poetry or stolen kiss in a parlor ever could. It shattered the last remaining fragments of my New York armor. Tears spilled over my eyelashes, warm against his skin in the dark. I slid my hands from his grasp, reaching up in the pitch black until I found his face. I traced the hard line of his jaw, the scar on his cheek. "Elias," I breathed. He leaned into my touch, and there, buried beneath a wolf pelt, while the world outside tried to freeze us to death, he finally closed the distance. His lips found mine. It wasn't a hesitant kiss. It was deep, desperate, and searingly warm. It tasted of survival, of fear, and of a raw, unyielding promise. I kissed him back with everything I had, wrapping my arms around his neck, pulling him closer, letting the heat of him burn away the cold forever. The white storm raged outside, burying the Wyoming territory in ice. But inside the dark, cramped shack, the fire had finally been lit. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that no matter what Silas Vance or the cruel frontier threw at us, we would not be extinguished. The aftermath of the White Death was a world held in suspended animation. For 3 days after we stumbled back from the line shack, the wind continued to howl, trapping us inside the cabin. But the oppressive, freezing prison had transformed. It was no longer a place of silent, awkward avoidance. Every glance across the iron stove, every accidental brush of our hands as we shared a tin cup of coffee, hummed with the memory of the dark shack and the desperate, profound promises we had made without speaking a single word. When the storm finally broke, it left behind a landscape buried under 4 feet of blinding, pristine powder. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy enough to ring in the ears. While Elias and Huck spent their daylight hours digging out the barn and trenching paths to the corrals, I set about deep cleaning the cabin. The blizzard had driven fine, powdery snow through the microscopic cracks in the chinking, and the violent winds had rattled the heavy log beams, loosening years of accumulated dust. Armed with a bucket of hot lye water and a stiff bristle brush, I tackled the main room. By mid-afternoon, I had dragged a heavy wooden chair to the center of the room to reach the lofted area above the bedroom space. It was a dark, cramped half-story, used mostly for storing extra winter blankets and Elias's old broken saddles. I hauled myself up, a kerchief tied over my hair, coughing as I disturbed a thick layer of dust. I crawled on my hands and knees along the rough-hewn floorboards, checking the joints where the roof met the walls, searching for the source of a persistent, icy draft. Near the far corner, tucked deep into the angle of the eaves, my hand brushed against a floorboard that didn't feel quite right. It was loose, shifting slightly under my weight. I pried my fingers into the gap and pulled the short plank free. Beneath it was a hollow cavity, lined with a scrap of oilcloth. Sitting inside the cavity was a small, ornate wooden box. It wasn't a pioneer's lockbox. It was a Cuban cigar box, made of polished mahogany, the kind I had seen stacked by the dozens in my uncle's New York study. It looked obscenely out of place amid the raw timber and dust of the Wyoming frontier. Curiosity, sharp and insistent, overcame my manners. I pulled the box out. It was surprisingly heavy, secured by a small brass clasp that had tarnished black. I sat back on my heels, wiping the dust from my hands onto my apron, and flicked the clasp open. I had braced myself for love letters. I had prepared my heart for a painful glimpse into Elias's past, ready to see the face of the woman who had hurt him so deeply that he had spent years sleeping in a freezing barn to protect his own heart. But there were no letters. There was no faded photograph. Laying on a bed of decaying velvet lining was a piece of stiff, cream-colored cardstock. I picked it up. It was a Union Pacific train ticket stub, first-class passage. From Chicago, Illinois to Cheyenne, Wyoming. It was dated 4 years ago. Beneath the ticket stub lay a piece of jewelry. I reached in and lifted it. It was a heavy, solid gold brooch. The craftsmanship was exquisite, entirely handmade, the gold shaped into a complex crest of a roaring bear. And right in the center, inlaid with tiny, flawless diamonds, was a large, stylized letter, V, Vance. The air in the loft seemed to instantly evaporate. I stared at the diamonds, the gold feeling heavy and cold against my palm. My mind raced, trying to force the jagged pieces of the puzzle together. Silas Vance, the cattle baron with the pale eyes and the tailored suits, who had sat on his black stallion in our yard and threatened our home. I've seen proud men freeze to death out here because they were too stubborn to accept a fair price. I remembered Elias's slip of the tongue. I won't let him take what is mine. Not again. Clara? The deep timbre of Elias's voice startled me so badly I nearly dropped the brooch. He had entered the cabin silently, his boots kicked off at the door. I heard the creak of the floorboards as he walked toward the center of the room, looking up at the loft. "I came back to see if you needed me to fetch more water. What are you doing up there in the dark?" I couldn't speak. I crawled to the edge of the loft, the golden brooch clutched tightly in my right hand, the train ticket in my left. I looked down at him. The afternoon sun was streaming through the frosty windowpane, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. I slowly opened my hand, holding the brooch out, so the sunlight caught the diamond-encrusted V. Elias froze. It was as if someone had driven a physical spike through his chest. All the color drained from his weathered face, leaving a pale, ashen mask. His eyes locked onto the gold, his pupils dilating until his eyes looked entirely black. The silence in the cabin stretched until it became a physical pressure. I scrambled down the wooden ladder, my skirts tangling around my legs. But I didn't care. I landed on the floor and walked slowly toward him. "Elias," I whispered, my voice trembling, "I found this hidden under a floorboard in the loft, along with a first-class ticket from Chicago." He didn't take the brooch from my hand. He stepped back, a violent shudder ripping through his massive frame. He turned away from me, walking to the stone fireplace, gripping the heavy wooden mantel with both hands. His knuckles turned white. He bowed his head, his broad shoulders heaving. "She told me her name was Sarah," he said. His voice was a harsh, broken rasp, stripped of all its usual strength. It sounded like a man bleeding to death. "She said she was a seamstress from St. Louis, said she wanted a quiet life." I walked up behind him, placing the brooch and the ticket on the wooden table. I didn't touch him yet. I let him speak. "I met her in town," he continued, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I fell in love with her. I brought her here. I built the extra rooms on this cabin with my own hands to make her comfortable. I gave her everything I had, but she was always restless, unhappy. She hated the dirt, the wind, the isolation." Elias let out a bitter, hollow laugh that held absolutely no humor. "One morning, I woke up and she was gone. Just a note on the table. She said the frontier was too hard. She said I was too hard. She said she couldn't live a life of poverty and dirt anymore, and she was taking the stagecoach back east to find someone who could give her what she deserved." He turned his head slightly, looking over his shoulder at the gold brooch gleaming on the table. "I spent 4 years believing I wasn't enough," Elias choked out, his chest hitching. "I spent 4 years thinking I had failed her. I thought I had dragged a fragile woman into a brutal world and broke her. But she wasn't a seamstress, Elias," I said softly, the realization crystallizing in my mind with terrifying clarity. "Silas Vance is from Chicago. He has a massive estate there." "She was his niece," Elias whispered, closing his eyes tightly. "I saw him talking to her once in town, but she said he was just asking for directions. I was so blind. I was such a damned, trusting fool." The strategy of a Wall Street predator. Silas hadn't just wanted to buy Mustang Creek. He had wanted to conquer it. He had sent a spy into Elias's bed, someone to find his weaknesses, to locate his deeds, perhaps to forge a transfer document when the time was right. "But she didn't finish the job, Elias," I said, stepping closer. "She didn't steal your deed. She didn't sign the ranch over to Silas. She hid the evidence of who she was. And she ran away." Elias turned to face me. The agony in his eyes was unbearable to look at, a raw, gaping wound, laid bare. "Why? If she was his pawn, why just leave?" "Because you are a good man," I said fiercely, stepping into his space, closing the distance between us. I reached up and grabbed the lapels of his shirt, forcing him to look down at me. "Because Silas sent her to ruin a naive cowboy, and instead she found a man of honor. She couldn't do it. She couldn't destroy you. But she couldn't face the wrath of Silas Vance either. So she ran." "It was all a lie," Elias murmured, tears finally welling in his eyes, spilling over his dark lashes to track through the dust on his cheeks. My whole life, the grief I carried, it was a manufactured lie. Yes, I said, my voice steady, anchoring him. It was a lie told by a coward. But the truth is standing right in front of you. I let go of his lapels and slid my arms around his waist, pressing my cheek against his chest right over his violently racing heart. He stood rigid for a moment, the shock and the trauma still warring in his muscles. Then, with a ragged, tearing sob, Elias collapsed against me, his massive arms wrapped around me, crushing me to him. He buried his face in my hair and he wept. He didn't cry for the woman he had lost. He wept for the years he had stolen from himself, the guilt he had carried, the walls he had built. He wept for the profound, agonizing betrayal of his own trust. I held him. I stood as a pillar of stone while the strongest man I had ever known fell apart in my arms. I stroked his hair. I pressed kisses to his shoulder, and I whispered fiercely into the quiet cabin. I am not her. I am not her. I am right here, Elias. I am never leaving. We stood there until the sun dipped below the horizon, the cabin fading into darkness. The gold brooch lay forgotten on the table, a venomous relic of the past that had finally lost its fangs. Silas Vance had tried to destroy Elias from the inside out, but in uncovering the poison, we had finally drawn it from the wound. When Elias finally lifted his head, his eyes were red and exhausted, but the heavy, crushing shadow that had always lurked behind them was gone. He looked at me, his hands gently cuping my face, his thumbs wiping the dust from my cheeks. "You found me, Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "In every way a man can be found, you found me." I leaned up and kissed him. A soft, slow promise in the dark. The ghost of Sarah Vance was finally dead. But the war with Silas was only just beginning. The thaw came not with a gentle whisper, but with the violent, tearing sound of breaking ice. By late April, the blinding white of winter had retreated, leaving behind a landscape of rushing, swollen creeks and thick, glutinous mud that sucked at our boots like wet mortar. The air smelled fiercely of wet earth, pine sap, and the raw, electric energy of rebirth. For a brief, glorious window of time, Mustang Creek Ranch felt like a paradise. The pregnant mares began to drop their foals, long-legged, wobbly creatures that Elias tended to with a gentleness that never failed to make my breath catch. The ledger I kept showed a promising season ahead. If we could get the horses to the summer auction in Cheyenne, we would have enough capital to build a proper windbreak for the north pasture, and perhaps even afford the glass panes I wanted for the front windows. But spring in Wyoming also marked the beginning of the range war season, the time when the snow melted, revealing the borders, the grass, and the greed of men. It happened on a Tuesday, under a bright, deceptive sky. I was at the table, a steaming cup of coffee by my elbow, carefully entering the birth weights of the new foals into the ledger. Elias was outside repairing a harness. Suddenly, the frantic drumming sound of a horse being ridden to its absolute limit echoed through the valley. I stood up, rushing to the door just as Huck brought his gelding to a sliding, mud-splattered halt in the center of the yard. The old man's face was purple with rage, his horse lathered in white sweat. "Elias!" Huck roared, his voice cracking like a rifle shot. Elias sprinted out of the barn, dropping the harness. "What is it? Did a mare go down?" "The wire!" Huck shouted, swinging down from the saddle, his boots sinking deep into the mud. "The entire stretch of barbed wire on the eastern ridge, cut to ribbons, hundreds of feet of it, snipped clean through at every post." Elias's face darkened. The yearlings were grazing the east ridge. "Gone," Huck spat, ripping off his hat and slamming it against his thigh. "Scattered to the four winds. And that ain't the worst of it." Huck pointed a shaking, calloused finger toward the upper elevations. "I rode up to check the upper creek, where the water flows down into our main troughs. Someone dumped 3 dead, bloated sheep carcasses right into the spring head. The water's tainted. Smells like rot and sulfur. If the horses drink from the lower troughs today, we'll lose half the herd to dysentery by tomorrow." The coffee cup I had been holding slipped from my hand, shattering against the porch floorboards. Silas Vance. He hadn't forgotten us. He had simply waited for the ice to thaw before making his move. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a siege. He was systematically cutting our fences, scattering our livelihood, and poisoning the very water we needed to survive. He was trying to starve us out. Elias didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. A terrifying, dead calm settled over him. It was the absolute stillness of a predator calculating the angle of the kill. "Huck," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "Take the dogs. Ride out and start tracking the yearlings. Don't cross the property line, but find as many as you can before dusk. I'm going to ride up to the spring head and clear the carcasses out." "Elias," I said, stepping off the porch, the mud instantly soaking the hem of my skirt. "I can help. I'll ride with you to the spring." "No." He turned to me, and the look in his eyes stopped me dead in my tracks. It wasn't the loving, vulnerable man from the blizzard. It was a man preparing for a slaughter. He strode past me, his heavy boots thudding against the porch stairs, and pushed the door to the cabin open. I followed him inside. He walked straight to the small lockbox beneath the floorboards where he kept his savings. He pulled out a small stack of greenbacks. "What are you doing?" I asked, my heart beginning to hammer a panicked rhythm. He turned around, holding the money out to me. His face was a mask of rigid, uncompromising stone. "Pack your trunk, Clara," Elias said. His words were clipped, devoid of emotion. "Pack everything you brought with you. Tomorrow morning, I am riding you into Cheyenne. There's enough money here to buy you a first-class ticket to Denver, maybe even as far as San Francisco. You have enough to start a respectable life somewhere safe." I stared at the money in his hand, then up at his face. The air in the cabin suddenly felt too thin to breathe. You want me to leave?" "I am sending you away," Elias corrected, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. "Silas isn't playing a gentleman's game. He cut the wire to draw us out, and he poisoned the water to cripple us. Tomorrow it might be a fire in the barn. The next day it will be a bullet through a window. I will not have you in the crossfire." "Elias, no," I stepped back, shaking my head violently. "We are married. This is my home. You promised. I promised to provide for you and protect you." Elias suddenly exploded, his voice booming off the log walls, making the hanging pots rattle. He threw the money onto the table, his composure finally shattering. "Do you understand what Vance is capable of? You found that brooch. You know what he did to me with Sarah. If he finds out you are the one keeping this ranch afloat, if he realizes what you mean to me, he won't just burn the barn. He will come for you, Clara. He will hurt you just to break me. And I cannot. I will not survive losing you. I would rather you hate me in Denver than bury you in Wyoming." His chest was heaving, his eyes wide and wild with a desperate, paralyzing terror. He wasn't trying to abandon me. He was trying to amputate his own heart to save my life. The fear in his eyes was infectious. But beneath it, the dormant volcano of my New York pride violently erupted. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I walked over to the table, picked up the stack of greenbacks, and with deliberate, terrifying calm, I threw them straight into the blazing iron stove. Elias stepped forward in shock as the money curled, blackened, and burst into bright orange flames. "What the hell are you doing?" he roared. "I am showing you exactly what I think of your protective instincts," I shouted back, my voice vibrating with a righteous, unyielding fury. I grabbed the heavy leather ledger and slammed it onto the table with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. "Look at me, Elias Thorne," I demanded, stepping right up to his chest, refusing to back down from his towering frame. "I did not survive the wolves of Wall Street to be chased off by a cheap frontier thug. I did not freeze half to death in a line shack. I did not blister my hands raw, and I did not give you my heart just to run away on a train the second things got dirty." Elias stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the anger momentarily derailed by my sheer ferocity. You think Silas Vance fights with bullets and dead sheep? I sneered, tapping my finger violently against the leather cover of the ledger. That is the tactic of a man who is legally vulnerable. He is trying to scare you into doing something stupid, like riding onto his property with a rifle, so he can have you legally hanged for trespassing and assault. I grabbed the collar of his shirt, pulling him down an inch to meet my blazing eyes. I know men like Silas Vance, Elias. I grew up in a house full of them. They hide behind money, they hide behind bought politicians, and they terrorize men like you because they know you fight with your fists. But I do not fight with my fists. I released his collar and slapped my hand flat on the ledger. I am the ledger, Elias. I fight with numbers, with contracts, with paper and ink. You want to go to war with a cattle baron? Fine, but we are not going to fight his way. We are going to calculate the exact financial loss of every inch of wire cut, every yearling lost, and every drop of water tainted. We are going to document his siege. We are going to build an ironclad legal and financial noose, and then we are going to kick the chair out from under him. The silence in the cabin was deafening. The only sound was the crackle of the greenbacks turning to ash in the stove. Elias looked at the fiery, untamed woman standing before him. He looked at my ink-stained fingers, my flushed cheeks, and the absolute, uncompromising fire in my eyes. The terror of losing me slowly evaporated from his expression, replaced by a profound, earth-shattering realization. He hadn't married a fragile bird that needed to be locked in a cage for its own safety. He had married a hawk. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Elias's face. It was the smile of a man who had just realized he wasn't going into battle alone. He reached out, his large hands gripping my waist, and he lifted me off the floor, pulling me tight against his chest. He kissed me hard, a fierce, bruising collision of teeth and lips that tasted of adrenaline and absolute devotion. When he set me back down, his blue eyes were blazing with a new, lethal light. "Document the wire, Clara," Elias said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "Document the water, document everything. Because when we finally bring Silas Vance down, I want him to know exactly who slit his throat." I opened the ledger, my pen poised over the paper. The fear was gone. The war had begun, and the wolves of Wyoming had no idea what they had just awoken. For 2 weeks, I did not sleep. The heavy leather ledger became my entire world. I documented every severed strand of barbed wire, calculating the cost of the steel, the labor to install it, and the market value of the scattered yearlings. I took water samples from the tainted spring, sealing them in glass apothecary's vials, and quantified the potential loss of the spring foals. I built a fortress of ink and numbers, transforming Elias's raw, bleeding anger into a cold, indisputable weapon of law. When we finally rode into Cheyenne, the spring mud clinging to our wagon wheels, I felt a dangerous, vibrating thrill of confidence. Beside me on the wagon seat, Elias looked like a man marching to a righteous execution. He wore his cleanest canvas coat, his Winchester stowed, trusting my weapon over his own. "We give this to Sheriff Dawson, and we demand a federal marshal be summoned," I said, my hand resting protectively over the ledger in my lap. "Vance has crossed the line from petty vandalism to interstate agricultural sabotage. The territorial governor won't be able to ignore it." Elias nodded, his eyes fixed on the brick building at the end of the muddy street. "Let's hang him, Clara." We stepped into the sheriff's office. It smelled of stale coffee, chewing tobacco, and anxious sweat. Sheriff Dawson, a portly man with a perpetually nervous twitch in his left eye, was seated behind his heavy oak desk. But he was not alone. Sitting in the corner, occupying the only leather armchair in the room, was Silas Vance. He was smoking a dark, aromatic cigar, looking as relaxed as a man waiting for a theater curtain to rise. Elias stopped dead. His hand instinctively twitched toward his hip, but he had left his revolver in the wagon at my insistence. "Sheriff Dawson," Elias said, his voice a low, warning rumble that made the lawman flinch. "I am here to file a formal complaint of sabotage, destruction of property, and the poisoning of a water supply against Silas Vance." I have the ledgers and the evidence to prove it. Silas chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that scraped against my nerves. He took a slow drag of his cigar and exhaled a thick cloud of blue smoke. Evidence, Silas mused, rolling the word around his mouth like a fine wine. How quaint. The cowboy and his catalog bride have been playing clerk. Shut your mouth, Silas, Elias growled. He stepped up to the desk and slammed my heavy ledger down in front of Dawson. Look at it, Sheriff. Every cut fence, every dead sheep. It's all there. Dawson looked at the ledger as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. He didn't touch it. He looked nervously past Elias, making eye contact with Silas. I'm afraid that ledger don't mean much, Elias, Dawson mumbled, wiping a bead of sweat from his receding hairline with a dirty handkerchief. It's a matter of jurisdiction. Jurisdiction. I stepped forward, my Wall Street instincts flaring into high alert. The crimes occurred on Mustang Creek property. That is your jurisdiction, Sheriff. Silas stood up, brushing a speck of ash from his pristine wool trousers. He walked over to the desk, his pale eyes gleaming with a sickening, triumphant light. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored coat and pulled out a crisp, folded document tied with a red ribbon. The crimes occurred on my property, Mrs. Thorne, Silas said smoothly. He untied the ribbon and spread the heavy parchment across the ledger. Right at the bottom, pressed into the paper, was the heavy gold seal of the Wyoming Territorial Governor. What is this? Elias demanded, staring at the document. It's a deed, Elias, Silas said, his voice dripping with venomous pleasure. A fully ratified, legally binding deed to the Upper Creek and the entirety of the Mustang Creek homestead, signed, sealed, and delivered by the Capitol. The room spun. I grabbed the edge of the desk to steady myself, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. Reassignment of abandoned public domain, eminent domain, transfer of title to Silas Vance. This is impossible, I whispered, the blood draining from my face. He holds the original deed. You can't just buy land out from under a man. You can when the land is deemed disputed due to gross negligence and public hazard, Silas smiled, tapping the paper. Those cut fences, the tainted water. I reported those to the Territorial Land Office as signs of Elias's inability to manage his property, a hazard to the neighboring herds. The Capitol agreed to a quiet auction to a more stable investor. To me. The sabotage wasn't meant to drive us away. It was an illusion. A paper trail to manufacture a legal crisis while Silas bribed the corrupt officials in the Capitol to rewrite the map. I had prepared for a criminal trial. Silas had bypassed the law entirely and bought the courtroom. This is fraud, I shouted, rounding on Sheriff Dawson. This is a forged narrative purchased with blood money, and you know it. It's legal paper, ma'am, Dawson squeaked, shrinking back in his chair. I have to uphold the governor's seal. Silas leaned across the desk, bringing his face mere inches from mine. You thought you were so clever, didn't you, Clara? Playing the frontier accountant. But you're out of your depth. You're nothing but a disgraced runaway embezzler playing house with a dirt-poor cowboy who doesn't even own the dirt under his boots anymore. He knew. He had run my name. He had dug up my uncle's lies. I sent a wire to New York this morning, Silas hissed, his breath hot and smelling of tobacco. I imagine there's a Pinkerton detective already on a train westward to drag you back to a Manhattan jail cell in irons. You're finished. Both of you. He reached out and mockingly patted my cheek. It happened so fast I barely registered the movement. A roar tore from Elias's throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated primal violence. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't argue the law. He lunged across the oak desk, his massive hands grabbing Silas by the lapels of his expensive coat. With a terrifying display of brute strength, Elias lifted the cattle baron clean off his feet and hurled him backward. Silas crashed through the heavy wooden chairs in the corner, shattering them into splinters. Before Silas could even groan, Elias was on top of him. His fist came down like a sledgehammer. The sickening crack of Silas's jaw breaking echoed off the brick walls. "Elias, stop!" I screamed, lunging forward, but the room erupted into chaos. Sheriff Dawson was shouting, drawing his revolver with trembling hands. Two of Silas's mercenaries burst through the front door, rifles raised. "Get off him!" Dawson yelled, pointing the gun at Elias's back. "Get off the landowner, Thorne, or I'll shoot you where you kneel." Elias froze, his fist raised for a second strike, Silas's blood painting his knuckles. He looked back at me, his chest heaving, the terrifying red haze of violence slowly fading from his eyes, replaced by the grim realization of what he had just done. He had stepped right into the final phase of Silas's trap. Elias slowly stood up, raising his hands, his eyes never leaving mine. "Lock him up," Silas gasped from the floor, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the floorboards. He smiled, a grotesque, broken leer. "Assault with intent to kill. Trespassing on my property." Dawson grabbed Elias, shoving him roughly toward the iron door at the back of the office. "Elias!" I cried, trying to run to him, but one of the mercenaries grabbed my arm, holding me back. "Don't fight them, Clara!" Elias shouted as the iron bars swung open. "Let it go! Just go to Huck!" The heavy iron door slammed shut with a definitive hollow clang. The lock turned. I was left standing in the sheriff's office, my ledger sitting uselessly on the desk beneath the gold seal of a corrupt governor. Silas Vance dragged himself to his feet, holding his bleeding jaw. "You have until dawn, girl," Silas slurred, his pale eyes burning with a triumphant manic hatred. "At first light, my men are riding to Mustang Creek. We are burning the cabins, slaughtering the horses, and taking the land. And if you are still there, you will burn with it." The Cheyenne jailhouse was a tomb of freezing stone and rusted iron. Elias sat on the edge of the thin, hay-stuffed mattress, staring at the floor. The moonlight bled through the single barred window high above, casting long, skeletal shadows across the cell. His knuckles throbbed with a dull, distant ache, but the true pain was the suffocating weight in his chest. He had failed her. He had let his temper blind him. And in doing so, he had handed Silas Vance the exact rope needed to hang them both. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. Silas Vance appeared on the other side of the iron bars. His jaw was wrapped in a heavy white linen bandage, his tailored coat ruined with dried blood. But his pale eyes were alight with a sickening, euphoric victory. "It's over, Elias," Silas taunted, his voice a muffled, painful hiss through his wired jaw. "In 3 hours the sun comes up. My men are already saddled. By noon, Mustang Creek will be nothing but ashes and a memory." Elias didn't look up. He remained as still as a statue carved from Wyoming granite. "If you touch her," he rumbled, his voice scraping against the stone walls, "I will tear the bars out of this wall and pull your heart through your ribs." Silas laughed, a wet, agonizing sound. "She's long gone, cowboy. Women like her, city women. They understand when the numbers don't add up. She's probably halfway to Denver on the midnight freight train, running back to the civilized world and leaving you to the hangman." Elias closed his eyes. "Run, Clara," he prayed silently. "Please, for once, don't be stubborn. Just run." I did not run to the train station. I ran to the telegraph office. The wind whipped through the muddy streets of Cheyenne, biting through my shawl, but I couldn't feel the cold. I felt only a blinding, terrifying clarity. Elias had fought Silas with his fists and lost. I was going to fight Silas with my mind, and I was going to annihilate him. The telegraph office was dark, the closed sign hanging in the window. I grabbed a heavy iron horseshoe from the mud and smashed the glass of the front door. I reached through the jagged shards, unlocking the latch, and burst inside. The young telegraph operator, asleep on a cot in the back room, jolted awake, scrambling for a lantern. "What the— Hey! You can't be in here!" the boy shouted, holding up the lantern, his eyes wide at the sight of a soot-stained, wild-eyed woman. I marched behind the counter, reaching into my pocket. I slammed my mother's solid gold pocket watch, the last item of true value I possessed, onto the wooden desk. "Turn on the machine," I commanded, my voice snapping like a whip. "Open a direct line to New York City, now." The boy stared at the gold watch. then at my face. He scrambled to his chair and threw the electrical switches. Click-clack, tappity-tap. The machine hummed to life. The rhythm of the frontier gave way to the rhythm of Wall Street. "Who am I addressing?" the boy asked, his fingers hovering over the brass key. "Sterling and Hayes Investment Bank, Wall Street," I dictated, my mind operating with the cold, ruthless precision of a master chess player executing a checkmate. "Attention, senior partner, Arthur Hayes." Silas Vance was a cattle baron, but men like him didn't use their own money to buy territorial governors in massive herds. They used leverage. They used Eastern investors. While keeping Elias's ledgers, I had also reviewed the freight manifests and shipping records of the entire county. I knew exactly what Silas Vance was moving, and more importantly, what he wasn't moving. "Message begins," I said, my voice steady. "Silas Vance capital reserves fraudulent. Stop! Collateral land deeds currently under federal dispute. Stop! Stated herd count of 50,000 head is a fabrication. Actual count under 12,000. Stop!" The boy's fingers flew, translating my financial assassination into Morse code. "It's a shame, really," Silas said, leaning his cane against the iron bars of the cell. "You had a good run, Elias. You fought the land, you fought the weather, but you can't fight capital. Capital is a tide. It sweeps away the dirt." Elias stared at his hands. "You think money makes you a god, Silas. But out here, paper doesn't bleed, and paper doesn't keep you warm when the winter comes." "I don't need to be warm," Silas smirked through his bandages. "I just need to own the fire. Enjoy the dawn, Elias. It's the last one you'll see as a free man." Silas checked his gold pocket watch. 2 hours until sunrise. "Next line," I ordered, leaning over the telegraph desk, watching the brass key hammer the electrical contacts. "Vance Enterprise operating a massive speculative bubble. Stop. Using fabricated assets to secure further loans. Stop. Immediate audit required. Advise total withdrawal of credit to prevent catastrophic institutional loss. Stop." The operator paused, looking up at me, sweat beading on his forehead. "Lady, if this is a prank, they're going to trace it back to this office." "It's not a prank," I said softly, my eyes fixed on the machine. "It's an execution. Who do I sign it from?" I hesitated for a fraction of a second. Using my real name would flag the Pinkertons. It would prove to my uncle where I was. It was the ultimate risk. But looking at the brass key, all I saw was Elias in a cold, dark cell. "Sign it, Clara Montgomery," I said firmly. "Former lead auditor, Montgomery and Sons." The boy tapped out the final code. Tappity-tap-click. The message vanished into the copper wires, racing across the plains, over the mountains, straight into the heart of the beast that had ruined my life. I stood in the dim office, the adrenaline slowly crashing, leaving me hollow and exhausted. I looked out the broken window at the eastern horizon. The sky was bleeding from black to a bruised, pale purple. Dawn was coming. I had fired the lightning wire. Now I could only pray it struck its target before Silas Vance struck mine. The first rays of the sun crested the Wyoming plains, casting long golden shadows across the muddy streets of Cheyenne. Silas Vance stood outside the sheriff's office mounting his black stallion. 10 of his men were gathered around him, armed to the teeth, holding torches that smoked in the crisp morning air. "Ride hard," Silas commanded his men, his voice thick with malicious anticipation. "Leave nothing standing at Mustang Creek." Just as he spurred his horse, the door to the telegraph office across the street burst open. The young operator sprinted through the mud, waving a yellow slip of paper frantically. "Mr. Vance! Mr. Vance, wait!" the boy yelled. Silas pulled his horse up, glaring at the boy. "What is it? I have business to attend to." "Priority wire from New York," the boy gasped, handing the slip up to the cattle baron. "It came through with an emergency stop-all routing." Silas snatched the paper. He unfolded it with his one good hand. I stood in the shadows of the telegraph office doorway, holding my breath, watching him read. Silas's eyes scanned the yellow paper. Suddenly, the color completely drained from his face. His hand began to shake violently, the yellow paper fluttering in the morning breeze. He looked like a man who had just had his heart ripped out of his chest. Credit lines frozen. Stop. Investigation launched. Stop. All assets seized pending audit. Stop. You are ruined. No, Silas whispered, the word escaping him in a breathy, terrified wheeze. No, this is a mistake. This is my accounts. Boss? One of the mercenaries asked, noticing Silas's sudden paralysis. We riding out or what? Silas Vance looked at his men. He looked at the torches. Then slowly his pale eyes drifted across the street, piercing the shadows of the doorway. He saw me. I stepped out into the morning light. My dress was ruined, my hair was a tangled mess, and my hands were bleeding from the broken glass. But I stood tall, my spine straight, and I met the gaze of the Leviathan without a single ounce of fear. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The silence between us was the sound of an empire crumbling to dust. Silas dropped the yellow paper into the mud. His reign of terror over the Wind River Valley was over. The Wall Street lightning had struck, and it had burned him to the ground. The silence in the muddy street of Cheyenne was absolute. It was the heavy, breathless quiet of an avalanche finally coming to rest. Silas Vance stared at the yellow telegraph paper in the mud. His empire, built on intimidation, bribery, and fabricated ledgers, had been decapitated by a few taps of a brass key. The mercenaries surrounding him, men whose loyalty was rented by the hour, shifted uneasily in their saddles. They looked at Silas, then at the paper, and finally at me. "Boss?" the lead mercenary asked, his hand drifting away from his rifle. "We still riding or what? You owe us for the week." Silas didn't answer. He couldn't. He was a hollow shell of tailored wool and shattered pride. "He can't pay you," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the crisp morning air. I stepped off the boardwalk, my boots sinking into the street. "His credit lines in New York have been frozen. His accounts are seized pending a federal audit. Silas Vance doesn't have a single red cent to his name." The mercenary looked at Silas. Silas's silence was all the confirmation the man needed. With a disgusted spit into the dirt, the mercenary yanked his horse's reins. "No pay, no play, Vance," he growled. He whistled sharply to the others. "Come on, boys. Let's find work that actually pays." One by one, the armed men turned their horses and rode out of town. They didn't look back. Silas was left sitting on his black stallion, utterly alone in the center of the street. The heavy wooden door of the sheriff's office slowly creaked open. Sheriff Dawson peeked out, his nervous eyes darting from the departing mercenaries to the broken cattle baron. A coward to the core, Dawson possessed an uncanny instinct for recognizing when the wind had shifted. Dawson puffed out his chest, adjusting his gun belt, and stepped onto the boardwalk. "Well now, Mr. Vance," Dawson announced, his voice artificially loud. "It appears there are some discrepancies regarding your financial standing. And considering the severity of the assault charges Elias Thorne filed against you yesterday regarding the barbed wire and the tainted water, I think it's best you dismount. I'll be needing to impound that fraudulent deed, too." Silas slowly lifted his head. He looked at Dawson, a man he had bought and paid for just 24 hours ago. Then he looked at me. There was no rage left in his pale eyes. There was only the terrifying, vacant stare of a man who had stared into the abyss and realized the abyss was looking back. Without a word, Silas Vance turned his magnificent black stallion and rode slowly out of Cheyenne, heading toward a horizon that no longer belonged to him. "Sheriff," I said, turning my gaze to Dawson. "The keys." Dawson swallowed hard, nodding rapidly. "Yes, ma'am. Right away, Mrs. Thorne." I followed him back into the dim office. Dawson fumbled with his heavy iron ring, his hand shaking as he approached the cell. He jammed the key into the lock, turning it with a loud metallic clank, and pulled the heavy door open. Elias stepped out of the shadows. His face was bruised, his knuckles raw and split, and his shirt was stained with Silas's blood. He looked like a man who had braced himself for the gallows, only to find the sun shining instead. His blue eyes locked onto me, wide and intensely searching. "Clara?" he rasped. "What happened? Where are Vance's men?" "They left," I said softly, the adrenaline finally crashing out of my system, leaving my legs feeling like water. "His investors in New York pulled his funding. The bank seized his accounts. He's finished, Elias." Elias stared at me, the realization washing over him in slow, crashing waves. He looked at my soot-stained dress, the bleeding cuts on my hands from the broken glass, and the absolute, unwavering exhaustion in my eyes. "You did it," he whispered, stepping out of the cell. "You fought the Leviathan, and you broke his back." "I balanced the ledger," I managed to say, a watery smile breaking across my face. Elias didn't care about Sheriff Dawson. He didn't care about the blood or the dirt. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides, wrapping his arms around me and burying his face in the crook of my neck. He lifted me off the floor, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe. But I didn't care. I buried my hands in his dark hair, inhaling the scent of cedar, sweat, and salvation. "I told you," I murmured against his shoulder, tears finally spilling hot and fast down my cheeks. "I am never leaving." "I know," Elias choked out, his massive chest heaving. "God help me, Clara, I finally know." The Wyoming summer arrived in a blaze of golden light and emerald grass. The scars of the winter and the range war slowly began to fade beneath the relentless healing power of the sun. The dead wire was replaced, the spring head was cleared, and the new foals ran wild and strong across the eastern ridge. The telegraph I had sent to New York accomplished more than just destroying Silas Vance. The federal audit, triggered by my warning, ripped through Sterling and Hayes Investment Bank like a hurricane. The investigators didn't just find Silas's fraudulent assets. They uncovered the massive web of embezzlement my uncle had woven. By June, my uncle was sitting in a Manhattan jail cell, facing a mountain of federal indictments. The Pinkertons never came for me. My name was cleared in the Eastern papers. I was no longer a fugitive. I was free to return to the parlors, the crystal, and the high society of New York. But I didn't want New York. I wanted the wind. I wanted the smell of pine sap, the rough planks of the cabin floor, and the calloused hands of the man who had seen my soul on a dusty train platform. It was a late afternoon in August when we finally made it official. We didn't ride into town for church. We stood on the highest ridge of Mustang Creek, overlooking the valley that belonged entirely, indisputably, to us. The sky was an impossible endless blue, dotted with cottonwood clouds. There was no organ music, only the sound of the wind moving through the tall grass. There were no hundreds of high society guests. There was only the circuit judge, standing with a worn Bible. To our left stood Martha Higgins, beaming in her Sunday best, holding a bouquet of wild sage and Indian paintbrush. To our right stood Huck, wearing a stiff, uncomfortably clean collar, aggressively chewing his tobacco to hide the fact that his eyes were shining with unshed tears. I didn't wear a silk gown. I wore a simple dress of printed cotton, a pattern of tiny yellow wildflowers that I had sewn myself. My hair was swept up, pinned not with diamonds, but with a simple wooden comb Elias had carved for me from a piece of fallen oak. My hands, resting in Elias's, were still rough and scarred. I had never been prouder of them. Elias wore a clean white shirt and a dark vest, his Stetson held respectfully over his chest. His face was weathered, his jaw lined with the familiar rugged stubble, but his blue eyes were brighter than the summer sky. When the judge asked for our vows, Elias didn't recite a poem. He didn't promise me a life of ease or luxury. He looked down into my eyes, his thumbs gently brushing over the calluses on my knuckles. "I took your bag at the station because I saw a fighter," Elias said, his deep, gravelly voice carrying over the wind. "I offered you a roof, and you gave me a home. You fought the winter for me. You fought the devil for me. You took a broken, hardened man. and you gave him back his life." He took a shaky breath, the raw emotion bleeding through his steady tone. "I vow to stand between you and the wind, Clara. I vow to build our fire, to walk beside you through the mud and the snow, and to honor the brilliant, fierce woman you are, until the mountains crumble to dust." My chest ached with a joy so profound it felt like pain. "I came to you running from a lie," I said, my voice clear and ringing across the ridge. "I thought the world was entirely made of predators and victims. But you showed me what it means to be a partner. You didn't demand I be soft. You gave me the space to be strong. You are the bravest, truest man I have ever known. I vow to keep our ledgers honest, to keep our home warm, and to love you fiercely with every breath I have for the rest of my days." The judge smiled, closing his Bible. "By the power vested in me by the Wyoming Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. Elias, you may kiss your bride." Elias didn't hesitate. He tossed his Stetson into the grass, pulling me into his arms with a sweeping, possessive grace. He kissed me deeply, a kiss that held the memory of the freezing lion shack, the terror of the Cheyenne jail, and the absolute, unshakable triumph of our survival. When he finally pulled back, resting his forehead against mine, we were both breathless. The sun was beginning to set, casting a magnificent fiery glow over the Wind River Range. Elias reached up, his rough fingers gently tracing the line of my jaw, tucking a stray auburn curl behind my ear. He looked at my sun-kissed skin, the sharp, calculating eyes that had brought down an empire, and the fierce, unyielding love shining back at him. He smiled, that rare, breathtaking expression that belonged only to me. "You're far more beautiful than your picture, Clara," he whispered, his voice a low, sacred promise in the fading light. "Because you are the only truth I will ever need."
This story, set against the harsh and unforgiving landscape of the American West, carries a profound moral weight that reaches far beyond its setting, offering a timeless reflection on truth, resilience, love, and the quiet strength of human character. At its heart, it reminds us that identity is not defined by appearances, past mistakes, or the labels imposed upon us by others, but by the choices we make when we are tested to our limits. Clara arrives in Wyoming as a fugitive, burdened by deception and shame, believing that her worth must be disguised to be accepted. Yet, it is precisely her imperfections, her sharp mind, her courage, her refusal to surrender, that become her greatest strengths. Through her journey, we learn that authenticity, though frightening, is ultimately the only foundation upon which true connection can be built. Elias, on the other hand, represents a different kind of lesson: the courage to trust again after betrayal. His past has taught him that love can be weaponized, that vulnerability can be exploited, and yet he chooses not to let bitterness define him. Instead, he recognizes strength where others might see flaw, and in doing so, he demonstrates that real love is not blind. It is deeply perceptive. It sees clearly and chooses anyway. Together, their relationship teaches us that partnership is not about dominance or dependence, but about mutual respect, where each person brings their own strength to the table, whether it be physical endurance or intellectual brilliance. And both are equally vital for survival. The story also delivers a powerful critique of power and corruption embodied in Silas Vance, whose manipulation, greed, and reliance on intimidation mirror systems of injustice that exist in every era. Through Clara's strategic mind and refusal to be intimidated, we are reminded that brute force is not the only form of strength. Intellect, integrity, and courage can dismantle even the most imposing adversaries. Perhaps one of the most important lessons lies in the contrast between running away and standing one's ground.
Clara begins her journey, fleeing from injustice, but she grows into someone who confronts it head on, not with recklessness, but with clarity and purpose. This transformation teaches us that while escape may be necessary for survival, true freedom comes from facing what once frightened us and reclaiming control over our own narrative. Moreover, the story highlights the value of compassion and understanding between people. Elias does not punish Clara for her lie. Instead, he seeks to understand the fear behind it. Clara, in turn, does not judge Elias for his past wounds, but helps him heal from them. In a world often quick to condemn, their story encourages us to look deeper, to recognize the hidden struggles others carry, and to respond not with judgment, but with empathy. Ultimately, this is a story about building something real in a world that often feels uncertain and hostile. It tells us that love is not about perfection, that strength is not about never breaking, and that home is not a place, but a bond forged through shared hardship and unwavering loyalty. The greatest lesson it offers is this: no matter how far we fall, no matter how much we lose, we always have the power to rise again, not by becoming someone else, but by fully embracing who we truly are. This channel is dedicated to stories of the Wild West, cowboys, frontier love, motherhood, human compassion, and the deep bonds that connect us all. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to support more stories like this.